Subscribe to the channel now. Turn on notifications so you don't miss any stories that defy reason and take you inside the most terrifying and enigmatic places in the world. We want to hear from you. Where are you watching from? What part of the story gave you the most chills? Comment below and share your theories. The 1900 house in Atchison, Kansas seemed to await visitors who would never leave the same. Its dusty windows reflected only shadows and nothing more. The wind drifted through the hallways as if whispering ancient stories no one could comprehend. From the moment the DeFeo family bought the property, rumors of inexplicable events circulated in the neighborhood. But no one, neither neighbors nor occasional curious onlookers, dared to venture deep into its silent corridors. Jack DeFeo, the new owner, felt a strange pull as he stepped inside the house. It wasn't ordinary curiosity, but a compulsion that grew with each step. The floorboards creaked unevenly, and the doors seemed to close behind him on their own, without any wind to explain it. He wandered the rooms in silence, observing damp patches that formed almost human shapes on the walls. Nothing screamed for attention, and yet there was a feeling that someone or something was following him, always lurking. On the very first day, objects began to inexplicably shift places. A book resting on a solid wood shelf appeared on the kitchen table. A picture that had previously hung straight was now crooked, as if it had been adjusted by invisible hands. Jack dismissed the signs as mere coincidence, but the feeling of being watched became unbearable. At night, footsteps echoed upstairs, even though they knew he was alone. Each creak of the wood sounded like a warning. The first interaction with the unknown happened during a cold January night. Jack was getting ready for bed when he heard a child's laughter coming from the hallway. The house was completely deserted, and yet the laughter continued, getting closer and closer. He turned on his flashlight and followed the sound, but found nothing. The hallway seemed to stretch endlessly, distorting the proportions of the space. When he returned to his room, the mirror reflected not only his image, but also a small silhouette, which disappeared when he blinked. It wasn't long before more aggressive signs emerged. Objects began to fall to the floor for no apparent reason. Doors slammed shut, as if the air possessed a will of its own. Jack experienced intense heat in some rooms, intense cold in others, and a feeling of dampness permeated the environment irregularly. Each phenomenon was measured and documented, but nothing explained the origin of the events. It was as if the house itself had a consciousness, a memory hidden within its centuries-old walls. The story's unseen antagonist, a presence no one could explain, seemed to test Jack. It pushed limits, challenged courage and rationality. Every attempt to rationalize events encountered obstacles. Objects appeared in impossible places, voices whispered familiar names, and the scent of ancient incense filled the air from no known source. The tension became physical, almost suffocating, and Jack's curiosity battled the visceral fear that kept him constantly on edge. During the first few days, Jack began to notice subtle patterns. The phenomenon wasn't random. Certain areas of the house reacted to him more intensely, especially the upstairs bedrooms, where the energy seemed concentrated. He found small messages scrawled on the wall with chalk, crooked letters that formed disconnected words, but laden with emotional meaning. At night, the presence seemed to draw closer, as if waiting for something Jack didn't yet understand. Each of his steps provoked subtle responses, almost as if the house were alive. Tensions reached a peak when an old photograph of the previous family fell from a shelf and shattered on the floor. Among the shards, Jack found a note hidden behind the frame with words that appeared to have been written recently. "Don't trust what you see. Don't trust what you feel." It was impossible to know if the message came from the past or the present, but it put Jack on high alert. He began recording everything with cameras, sensors, and audio recordings, trying to capture what the eyes couldn't see. The house, however, was not limited to acts of spectral vandalism. There were moments of absolute silence where even the slightest sound seemed deafening. In these pauses, Jack felt the intensity of the presence, a weight in the air, an invisible pressure that demanded respect and attention. The mystery grew denser each day, but his own determination to understand the truth transformed fear into obsession. He was determined to discover the origin of it all, even knowing that no one had ever left Sallie House completely unscathed. And so, the story begins. An ordinary man confronting unseen forces that defy logic and perception. Sallie House not only holds secrets from the past, but also imposes tests on the present. Every moving object, every whisper in the dark, every shadow cast on the house's walls forms the prelude to something greater, a mystery that no visitor could fully explain, and that Jack is about to face head-on. The neighborhood around Sallie House was tranquil in appearance, with old wooden houses painted in pastel shades and sidewalks lined with deciduous trees. But Jack's house stood out from all the others. Surrounded by a rusty fence and neglected gardens, it conveyed a sense of almost intentional abandonment. Neighbors avoided eye contact and whispered stories of visitors who had tried to spend a night and then suddenly moved away without explanation. Some reported hearing children crying in the early hours of the morning or seeing shadows passing through windows with no light at all. Historically, Atchison had already been home to 19th-century conflicts and tragedies, including fires and mysterious disappearances which left invisible marks on the fabric of the town. These events seemed to echo in Sallie House, giving it an aura of dark ancestry. Jack DeFeo, though curious and rational, began to reveal facets of his personality that the house itself seemed to explore. Before acquiring the property, he worked as an investigative journalist, specializing in stories of paranormal phenomena and unexplained events. His determination to capture concrete evidence was both professional and personal. Jack possessed a natural skepticism, but the power of the unknown challenged him daily. He noted every detail in his notebook, noises, smells, temperatures, like a scientist facing an experiment beyond the reach of logic. Beside him was his assistant, Maria Thompson, a local historian passionate about old documents and city records. She brought knowledge of the genealogy of families who had lived in the region, including the former owners of the house. Maria cautiously explained that Sallie House had once been a home marked by tragedies, sudden deaths, strange accidents, and reports of unusual childhood behavior from a girl named Sallie, whose memory seemed to linger within the walls. Sallie's story wasn't just an urban legend. School records and old newspapers confirmed her existence, and some disturbing events linked to her family. Maria, however, maintained an emotional distance from the phenomenon, insisting that the documentation be her compass in the investigation. The invisible antagonist, or the presence they called Sallie, became more evident as the days went by. She seemed to react to human emotions: joy, fear, anger, and curiosity. Jack's every move was monitored. Every attempt to rationally understand events was met with subtlety or increasing aggression. Objects that had previously fallen on their own began to move strategically, creating patterns almost like coded messages. The challenge was not only to physically survive the experience, but to decipher the intentionality behind the presence's actions. It was as if Sallie was testing Jack and Maria's ability to understand, respect, and interact with something that transcends human explanation. Secondary characters began to emerge, each adding layers to the narrative. Thomas, the elderly neighbor, was a man with a sharp memory who recalled stories of the town told by his parents and grandparents. He warned Jack and Maria about the house's behavior, but his warnings sounded more like fragments of superstition than practical advice. Still, he carried historical details that would become crucial in deciphering the strange patterns of the presence. Another important character was Leah, an amateur medium who had been summoned by Jack. She could sense emotions and presences, but her insights were vague, often ambiguous, leaving more questions than answers. Leah represented the boundary between reason and the inexplicable, provoking tension between skepticism and faith in the story. The world of Sallie House wasn't merely physical, it carried psychological and cultural layers. The house's design reflected early 20th century trends in the United States: cramped rooms, long corridors, and steep staircases built for functionality and durability, but now becoming elements of suspense. The heat of an old oven or the creaking of wooden floors transformed into instruments of tension, amplifying the effect of presence. Every architectural detail, from sliding doors to windows that closed automatically, became part of the plot, manipulating perceptions and emotions. As the characters explored the house, past and present intertwined. Maria discovered old letters, written by Sallie's relatives, describing the girl's inexplicable behavior and events that no one could explain. Jack, in turn, recorded everything, trying to create an objective narrative, but each recording brought strange distortions, voices, footsteps, whispers that defied technology and logic. The interaction between the characters and the environment created continuous tension. Curiosity and fear walk hand in hand, while the mystery of Sallie House grows, weaving a web of suspense that spares no one. In this world, the line between reality and supernatural phenomena began to blur. Every action of Jack, Maria, and the secondary characters provoked responses from the presence, forming an almost living cycle of observation and reaction. The rules of daily life were subverted, objects floated, sounds echoed without source, shadows moved independently of light. And yet, each element served to deepen the character's understanding of the house's past and the nature of the presence, creating a sense that Sallie House was not just a setting, but an active character shaping the narrative. The February cold brought not only external frosts, but a growing sense of threat inside Sallie House. Each room seemed more alive, more aware of Jack and Maria's presence. Objects that had previously moved erratically began to follow deliberate patterns. Books fell in strategic piles, doors slammed in sequences reminiscent of heartbeats. Jack realized that the house wasn't just reacting to them, it was communicating. But the message remained indecipherable, provoking increasing anxiety and frustration. The central conflict began to intensify when previously subtle phenomena became aggressive. One day, while walking down the upstairs hallway, Jack felt the floor give way for a fraction of a second. The sensation of falling was enough to trigger a panic attack. The creaking of the wood turned into muffled screams, as if the hallways echoed voices from the past. Maria tried to interpret the events, correlating them with historical records, but every rational explanation seemed insufficient. The atmosphere pressured the characters, forcing quick decisions and increasing the tension. Meanwhile, the presence of Sallie House seemed to test emotional limits. It reacted to irritation, fear, and curiosity in unpredictable ways. When Jack tried to record events with cameras and sensors, the technology failed. Batteries died, microphones picked up intense static, and cameras recorded only distorted flashes. It was as if the house rejected any attempt at objective documentation, insisting on maintaining its control over the narrative. Each attempt at rationalization met with direct resistance, making the experience more intense and personal. Secondary characters also began to face physical and psychological risks. Leah, the medium, went into a trance during a visit, revealing fragmented information about Sallie and past events. Her disjointed words suggested that the girl had witnessed tragedies and developed a self-awareness, linked to past fears and resentments. The presence was not only aggressive, but selective. It seemed to choose moments and targets, pressuring each character in a distinct way. The conflict, then, was not only between humans and phenomenon, but also internal, as each individual confronted their own limits and fears. One particular incident marked the escalation of the conflict. One night, Maria went down to the kitchen to get water and found the hallway completely transformed. The walls seemed to move, narrowing into tortuous passages, and shadows were projected erratically, creating the impression of multiple figures following every movement. Her heart racing, she ran to Jack's room, only to find the door locked from the inside, with no one having closed it. Panic became collective, and tension rose as they realized that the house offered not only passive resistance, but an active challenge to their sanity and safety. Beyond the physical challenges, emotional obstacles arose. Jack, accustomed to analyzing events logically, began to doubt his own perception. Maria felt the pressure of the responsibility of interpreting the house's history without getting lost in the growing terror. Their relationship oscillated between cooperation and conflict as fear and exhaustion increased. Each disagreement was amplified by the hostile environment, transforming small misunderstandings into emotional crises. Sallie House seemed to manipulate these tensions, exacerbating the internal conflict to intensify the experience of its inhabitants. As the conflict deepened, new information emerged. Jack discovered old documents in a secret compartment detailing tragic events involving Sallie's family and accidents that were never fully explained. The information revealed patterns of death and disappearance, suggesting that the presence was not just a ghost, but perhaps the manifestation of traumas accumulated over decades. Each discovery increased the sense of urgency. Understanding the past was crucial to surviving the present. The obstacles also manifested themselves in unpredictable ways. Sometimes the house seemed to abandon its aggression, only to intensify it moments later in cycles that defied any attempt at planning. Sounds of footsteps, laughter, and whispers followed the characters through different rooms, creating a psychological effect of constant pursuit. The feeling of claustrophobia increased, reinforced by narrow corridors, steep stairs, and doors that changed position as if the house were alive. Every movement demanded maximum attention, as any carelessness resulted in immediate consequences. At the same time, the narrative expanded the understanding of the relationship between characters and environment. The presence, though aggressive, provided subtle clues about its origin and intentions. Jack began to perceive patterns of behavior that indicated intelligence and emotion, as if Sallie House reacted not only to actions, but to intentions and thoughts. Maria interpreted these clues in light of historical records, trying to decipher the house's internal logic. This balance between observation and reaction transformed the conflict into a game of patience, courage, and perception. The conflict culminated in a feeling of inescapability. It wasn't just the house that challenged Jack and Maria, but also their own physical, emotional, and cognitive limitations. Each obstacle overcome revealed another, always more complex and personal. Sallie House became a living antagonist, shaping the narrative with calculated precision, forcing each character to confront not only the mysteries of the past, but also their own vulnerabilities and fears. As the presence at Sallie House intensified, small parallel stories began to emerge, subtly but powerfully connecting past and present. Maria discovered a diary hidden inside an old cupboard. It belonged to Sallie's mother, a tormented woman who recorded episodes of her daughter's strange behavior and inexplicable domestic accidents. The pages were stained and yellowed, but revealed patterns of recurring tragedies, objects moving on their own, laughter and cries that no one heard, and a growing tension among family members. This diary not only provided historical context, but also served as a mirror to current events, reinforcing the feeling that the house was a living organism. The relationship between Jack and Maria also became an important emotional subplot. As they confronted increasingly aggressive phenomena, tensions between logic and intuition intensified. Jack insisted on finding rational explanations, while Maria leaned towards historical and psychic interpretations. This dynamic created internal conflicts that reflected the external pressure of the house, showing how Sallie House manipulated not only the physical environment, but also the psychology of its occupants. Small discussions about strategic decisions, such as choosing rooms to explore or equipment to use, revealed human frailties and strengthened the suspense narrative. Secondary characters continued to contribute to the complexity of the plot. Thomas, the elderly neighbor, brought old newspaper clippings describing unexplained events in the town, including mysterious disappearances of children that coincided with periods of change at Sallie House. His memories and documents reinforced the historical nature of the phenomenon, showing that the presence now confronting Jack and Maria was not isolated, but part of a cycle of tragedies spanning generations. This historical subplot added depth to the main conflict, transforming the mystery into something deeper and more deeply rooted. Another element of tension arose with Leah, the amateur medium. During a nighttime investigation session, she entered a deep trance and revealed fragmented images, children playing in hallways that no longer existed, locked doors opening on their own, shadows watching her every move. Her visions suggested that the presence was not merely a vengeful ghost, but a consciousness formed from repressed emotions and memories of the family that inhabited the house. This insight added layers to the narrative. The phenomenon was not one-dimensional but complex and multifaceted, defying any attempt at simplification. The temporal factor also became crucial. Events at Sallie House followed their own rhythm, almost as if the house established schedules for interacting with its occupants. Certain times of day or night intensified the phenomena, footsteps that echoed only at dawn, children's laughter that arose after sunset, doors that locked for hours without explanation. Jack began to record these occurrences, realizing that the house seemed to create deliberate patterns to test patience, courage, and perception. This temporal pressure added urgency to the investigation and deepened the feeling of imminent danger. Smaller subplots also contributed to the narrative tension. Jack and Maria's personal belongings began to disappear and reappear in unexpected places, suggesting that the presence was observing and interacting with them in a personal way. Family photos, notebooks, and recording equipment were moved around, altering interpretations of events and requiring constant adaptation. Each action of the characters generated a reaction from the house, reinforcing the feeling that they were in a highly complex psychological game. Despite the pressure, small moments of interaction between the characters allowed for brief emotional relief. Quick conversations about childhood memories, observations about the house's behavioral patterns, and attempts to decipher messages on the walls created moments of humanity within the horror. These instants, though short, strengthened the bond between Jack and Maria and provided contrast to the supernatural events, making the plot richer and more balanced. At the same time, the subplot of Sallie House as a living organism began to unfold. Patterns of object movement, temperature changes, and alterations in the hallways were not random. They responded to human emotions, intentions, and decisions. The presence seemed to teach a lesson, prompting the characters to develop observation, patience, and courage. Each physical or psychological obstacle intertwined with the subplots, ensuring that nothing was gratuitous or unnecessary, and that each element contributed significantly to the central conflict. The balance between past and present, between rationality and intuition, and between physical and emotional tension created a complex narrative web. Each subplot was interconnected with the main arc, reinforcing the feeling that Sallie House was not just a haunted house, but a catalyst for profound human challenges, shaping behaviors and revealing hidden fragilities. The reader felt not only fear, but also the inevitability of confronting the unknown, in an environment where every action had an immediate consequence. The tension that had built up in the previous days reached its peak on a particularly cold winter night. Jack and Maria had spent hours reviewing old recordings and documents, trying to find a pattern that would explain the phenomena, but nothing seemed sufficient. Until an unexpected discovery completely changed their perception of Sallie House. While investigating the basement, Jack found a hidden door behind a rotting wooden bookcase. The small, almost imperceptible door led to a room not included in the house's original plans. The air was heavy, thick with mold, and a metallic odor reminiscent of old iron. In the center of the room, a circle of objects, broken dolls, wooden toys, and yellowed letters, seemed to have been arranged with meticulous care. The pattern resembled children's symbols, but there was something unsettling about the arrangement. Each toy was oriented in a specific direction, pointing towards the back wall. As they approached, Jack and Maria noticed something that made their hearts race. Etched into the wall, almost imperceptible beneath the layer of dust and mold, was a set of initials and dates. The dates coincided with tragic events in Sallie's family and former residence, including accidents and sudden deaths. But the most shocking was the last set of initials. Jack's. It felt as if someone or something had been watching them for a long time, and now had left an explicit warning for him. At that moment, the presence that had accompanied them for weeks manifested itself clearly and directly. There were no shadows, whispers, or children's laughter. The air trembled as if the house itself were breathing, and Jack felt an intense, almost suffocating pressure against his chest. Maria, holding his hand, noticed that the cards and dolls in the circle had changed position. Now they pointed directly to the secret door, as if indicating that something needed to be discovered there. The house not only reacted to them, it guided their actions, demanding understanding, attention, and courage. The real turning point came with the revelation of Sallie's diary, found among the objects. In its yellowed pages, the girl described moments of life and death, fears and resentments that had been silenced for decades. She wasn't just a haunted child, she was someone whose consciousness had been preserved within the house, absorbing every traumatic event that had occurred there. And even more disturbing, she mentioned future visitors, describing personality traits that matched Jack and Maria exactly. It was impossible that it was a coincidence. The presence had consciousness, memory, and somehow a perception of the future. And it had been testing them since day one. From that discovery onward, every interaction with the house changed radically. The fear didn't diminish, but understanding what they were facing brought a new kind of tension. Now, it wasn't just about surviving, but about deciphering messages, interpreting patterns, and acting according to Sallie's will. Every mistake could have direct consequences. Every action needed to be carefully considered. The conflict gained a strategic and intellectual dimension, where reasoning and courage became tools for survival. Another important impact of the turning point was on the relationship between Jack and Maria. Jack's skepticism began to give way to the need to accept the inexplicable, while Maria realized that her historical interpretations needed to align with a logic that transcended records and documents. This shift created an unprecedented dynamic, absolute cooperation, but also constant tension, as each dealt with fear and pressure differently. Sallie House, with its latent consciousness, manipulated emotions and decisions, bringing them closer and testing them at the same time. The event also revealed that the presence was not one-dimensional. Dolls, letters, and antique objects were not merely manifestations of a childlike spirit. They were tools of communication and control. Every move by Jack and Maria provoked a calculated response from the house. The turning point not only demonstrated the consciousness of Sallie House, but also showed that they were facing something that possessed historical memory, its own intelligence, and a will to interact with the living in a deliberate way. At the height of the night, the pressure reached a physical climax. Doors slammed shut, chains hanging in the attic began to sway, and the floor trembled beneath Jack's feet. Lights flickered on the recording equipment, revealing distorted images of dolls and childlike shadows projected onto the walls. It was at that moment that Jack and Maria understood. The true test of Sallie House was not physical survival, but deciphering its enigma and respecting its memory. The story was about to change radically, and neither of the protagonists would ever see the world the same way again. After discovering the secret room and Sallie's diary, Jack and Maria realized that nothing would ever be the same again. The air in Sallie House felt heavy, laden with an almost tangible expectation. Every hallway, every step, seemed to watch them, demanding attention and respect. Their presence made it clear that their consciousness wasn't limited to the past. Now, the present and their immediate actions were under constant scrutiny. The first direct effect was psychological. Jack, previously confident in his objectivity as an investigative journalist, began to question his own perception of reality. Patterns that once seemed random now appeared intentional, and every mistake could be interpreted as disrespect or a challenge to Sallie's conscience. The tension became physical. His heart raced, his hands sweated, and his breathing became erratic as he walked through familiar corridors. Every attempt to interact with the house required planning and courage, transforming everyday activities into tests of mental and emotional endurance. Maria, on the other hand, felt the impact of historical responsibility more intensely. As a historian, she understood that each discovery revealed deep layers of unresolved events. But now she saw that the ancient documents were not just stories. They were coded messages, left to guide or test future occupants of the house. The pressure to correctly interpret each clue increased her anxiety, and small lapses in analysis or attention resulted in more aggressive phenomena: doors locking themselves, objects falling, deafening noises in adjacent rooms. The relationship between the protagonists also underwent significant changes. The shared fear brought them closer emotionally, but also revealed vulnerabilities. Arguments arose frequently, often motivated by different interpretations of what the house wanted from them. Each disagreement, however, had immediate consequences. The environment responded with greater intensity, reinforcing the need for cooperation and clear communication. Sallie House subtly shaped human behavior, using fear and pressure as instruments of learning and survival. Physical consequences also began to manifest. Jack noticed unexplained bruises, light scratches, and pressure marks on his hands and shoulders, as if the house were testing the human body's resistance. Maria felt continuous chills and waves of intense cold in specific locations, while objects moved around them, sometimes in almost logical patterns, other times in absolute chaos. Each manifestation reinforced that the presence possessed an understanding not only of actions, but also of human emotions, manipulating the environment to provoke specific reactions. Beyond the individual impact, the turning point brought important narrative consequences. Secondary subplots, Sallie's diary, the historical records, Leah's visions, began to converge with the central conflict. Each clue obtained from interactions with the house revealed more about the origin of the presence and the events that shaped it. Jack and Maria realized that solving the enigma was not just a matter of physical survival, but of understanding the complete history of Sallie House, respecting the past, and reacting appropriately to the present. Another crucial effect was the increased unpredictability. Sallie House reacted not only to what they did, but also to how they thought, felt, and interpreted the environment. Small acts such as rearranging objects or interpreting symbols resulted in immediate or delayed responses, creating a constant cycle of action and reaction. This heightened the narrative tension, making any moment of complacency impossible. Every step needed to be measured, every decision reflected upon, as the presence left no room for impulsive errors. Ultimately, the turning point redefined Jack and Maria's objective. It was no longer just about documenting or understanding supernatural phenomena, but about deciphering and respecting the consciousness that inhabited Sallie House. Each consequence and reaction of the house served as practical lessons about human limits, perception, and courage. The experience transformed them, forcing personal and collective evolution. The house was not merely a setting, but an active character, testing and shaping the narrative at every moment. With the internal and external conflict at its peak, Jack and Maria understood that the journey was far from over. The consequences of the turning point were reflected in every gesture, every decision, and every interaction with the house, preparing them for even greater challenges that would arise later in the story. Sallie House remained vigilant, demanding maximum attention and absolute respect, while the enigma that sustained Sallie's presence began to reveal its full complexity. The days following the turning point were a constant test of emotional, physical, and intellectual endurance for Jack and Maria. Sallie House offered no respite. Every hallway, every shadow, every object seemed to watch their movements, demanding continuous attention and respect. But contrary to the initial paralyzing fear, a transformation began to emerge. The protagonists realized that simply reacting to the environment was not enough. It was necessary to understand, anticipate, and interact strategically with the presence that controlled the house. Jack, who had always relied exclusively on logic, began to perceive subtle nuances in the house's behavior. He learned to recognize patterns in the movements of objects, in temperature fluctuations, and in the sounds from upstairs. Each clue became a tool, allowing him to plan movements with greater precision. His evolution was silent, but visible. Initial impulsiveness gave way to meticulous observation, and absolute skepticism yielded to a practical form of acceptance, not faith, but an understanding of what was necessary to survive and move forward. Maria, in turn, deepened her historical and emotional understanding of Sallie House. Each diary, letter, and old record she analyzed provided insights that went beyond simple narrative. She began to identify patterns in the presence's behavior and to understand that Sallie's consciousness was not randomly malicious, but guided by experiences of trauma and pain accumulated over decades. Maria learned to interpret objects, symbols, and environmental changes as coded messages, transforming her fear into an instrument for reading and action. The protagonist's growth wasn't limited to intellectual development. The constant pressure of their environment forced them to develop courage and emotional resilience. Each failure or mistake provoked physical reactions in the house: doors slamming, objects falling, extreme temperatures, but also provided learning opportunities. Jack and Maria discovered limits of endurance they had never experienced before, facing situations that tested their patience, self-control, and adaptability. This gradual evolution was perceptible. Where fear once paralyzed, now calculated action emerged. Where there was once doubt, now there was strategy. Their interaction also transformed. Shared fear had brought Jack and Maria closer, but recent experiences demanded clear communication, coordination, and mutual trust. Every decision needed to be discussed, every move planned. This intense cooperation transformed their relationship, strengthening emotional bonds and creating a dynamic of complementarity. Jack provided logical analysis, while Maria offered intuitive and historical interpretation. Together, they became more than survivors. They became strategic partners, capable of facing the unknown with precision. New challenges continually arose, maintaining the intense pace of the narrative. During an exploration of the attic, they found old objects they hadn't noticed before: toys, clothes, and letters from children who had lived in the house decades ago. The presence reacted instantly, altering the arrangement of objects, closing doors, and turning off lights. But instead of retreating, Jack and Maria applied what they had learned. They interpreted the movements as signs, following subtle clues and avoiding direct confrontations. The house continued to test limits, but now they were able to respond with intelligence and calm instead of blind fear. Growth was also reflected in perception and empathy skills. Jack began to understand that Sallie House was not just an antagonist. It was a living record of memories, fears, and resentments. Each reaction from its presence was a manifestation of these elements, not just a random attack. Maria, understanding the accumulated pain of Sallie's consciousness, began to react carefully, avoiding actions that could provoke unnecessary aggression. This emotional sensitivity transformed the conflict into a delicate balance between action and understanding, survival and respect. The culmination of this growth became evident in critical situations. When faced with a series of violent events, thrown objects, sudden temperature changes, and voices echoing throughout the house, Jack and Maria applied strategies based on observation, historical interpretation, and cooperation. They began to anticipate the presence of threats, neutralizing the danger more effectively, and reducing the intensity of its manifestations. Fear remained, but it was now manageable, transformed into a tool for alertness and focus. Finally, overcoming challenges and growing prepared the protagonists for what was to come in the climax. They not only survived physical and psychological trials, but also internalized lessons about patience, observation, respect, and courage. Sallie House, which was once just a place of terror, became a laboratory for human development, testing limits and capabilities. Jack and Maria evolved from simple, skeptical investigators into individuals aware of the complexities of the world and the influence of the past on the present. With their accumulated experience, Jack and Maria began to realize that Sallie House was not merely a sequence of random events, but an organized, intelligent, and almost strategic presence. Every corridor, every shadow, every object had a function: to guide, to test, or to punish. The tension increased as they understood that the climax of the story would not be a single isolated event, but a series of decisions that would require courage, reasoning, and empathy combined. One of the first steps they took was to systematize the information they had gathered. They mapped each incident, each physical alteration, and each sound phenomenon, searching for patterns. Sallie's diary, old letters, and Leah's visions began to be analyzed from the perspective of codes or subliminal messages. Each clue revealed connections between past and present, requiring meticulous attention to avoid mistakes that could intensify the house's hostility. The preparation became both intellectual and emotional. They needed not only to understand the logic of the house, but also to accept that they were dealing with a consciousness that transcends common human understanding. Meanwhile, they resolved the secondary subplots that had accumulated. The historical question of Sallie's family was clarified. Old records confirmed deaths and accidents that previously seemed isolated, showing a continuity of tragedies linked to her presence. The pieces of the past began to fit together, providing a narrative thread that helped them anticipate the house's responses. Furthermore, the emotional tensions between Jack and Maria, which had previously threatened to compromise their actions, were softened by moments of intense trust and cooperation. Now, their relationship had become a strategic fortress. Mutual understanding and clear communication transformed fear into coordinated strength. The physical environment also began to be consciously manipulated by the protagonists. Locked doors were unlocked at calculated times, dangerous corridors were avoided or traversed with heightened caution, and objects scattered on the floor began to be interpreted as signs rather than mere obstacles. Each decision had an immediate consequence, but also indicated progression towards the climax. Sallie House continued to test limits, but Jack and Maria were now prepared to react more effectively, maintaining a balance between caution and action. The presence, in turn, intensified the build-up to the climax. Sounds of footsteps, children's laughter, and knocks on the walls emerged unpredictably, increasing adrenaline and forcing the protagonists to maintain total concentration. Lights flickered on the recording equipment, doors opened and closed on their own, and objects rearranged themselves in patterns that seemed to indicate direction or intention. Each manifestation served as a warning or challenge, reinforcing the need for constant observation. The narrative tension reached its peak. Any wrong move could trigger an unpredictable reaction from the house. Jack and Maria also prepared themselves psychologically. They understood that the climax would not only be a physical confrontation, but a direct interaction with Sallie's consciousness. Emotional balance, patience, and focused courage were necessary. Every moment of fear or doubt needed to be controlled so as not to amplify the aggressiveness of her presence. The preparation thus became a resilience training in which every thought, every decision, and every action was fundamental. The build-up to the climax also involved synchronizing subplots. Leah, the medium, contributed final visions that allowed them to predict patterns of the presence's behavior, albeit in a fragmented way. Thomas, the elderly neighbor, provided details about past events that repeated themselves in cycles within the house, allowing Jack and Maria to anticipate critical phenomena. The convergence of this information made it possible to create a coherent strategy in which action and reaction were interconnected, preparing them for the final confrontation without losing sight of the complexity of the presence. Finally, the atmosphere of Sallie House reached an almost palpable state of anticipation. Narrow corridors, creaking staircases, and silent rooms created maximum tension. Antique objects seemed positioned to lead Jack and Maria to the decisive moment. The physical and psychological environment was ready for the climax. The house not only responded to the protagonists, but guided them, demanding maximum attention and absolute courage. Everything converged on an inevitable confrontation, in which the history of Sallie House, the understanding of the past, and the evolution of the protagonists would be definitively tested. The night of the climax fell upon Sallie House with an almost physical density. The wind howled outside, but inside, the atmosphere seemed alive in its own way. Shadows lengthened and contracted, corridors creaked, and objects moved inexplicably, as if the house breathed in sync with Jack and Maria's fear. Each step they took seemed to echo endlessly, amplifying the feeling of constant surveillance. It was the culmination of weeks of tension, learning, and discovery. And Sallie's presence was about to reveal its most intense and direct form of interaction. It all began when Jack and Maria decided to confront the secret room again, knowing it was the epicenter of Sallie's consciousness. As they moved down the corridor, objects began to align in surprisingly clear patterns, forming symbols reminiscent of arrows and circles, visual instructions that guided every movement. There was no more room for doubt. Every action needed to be precise, every decision carefully planned. The past and present converged in that space, and the moment demanded a complete understanding of the lessons accumulated up to that point. As soon as they reached the center of the room, a wave of energy swept through the space. Doors slammed shut, lights flickered chaotically, and an intense cold enveloped them. Jack felt a pressure that seemed to crush his chest, while Maria watched objects float in almost ritualistic patterns, like pieces of a three-dimensional puzzle. Sallie's presence wasn't just perceptible, it was active, deliberate, manipulating every element of the space to test their courage, perception, and empathy. Each wrong step triggered an immediate phenomenon, but each correct decision created small victories, momentarily diminishing the house's aggression. The climax reached its peak intensity when Sallie's consciousness manifested itself audibly and clearly. A childlike voice, but laden with emotion accumulated over decades, echoed through the corridors. Do you understand now? The sound seemed to come from all directions, penetrating their minds and amplifying Jack and Maria's emotions. It was a mixture of challenge and invitation. Only by showing understanding and respect could they move forward without causing further harm to themselves. The psychological tension was almost unbearable, testing the limits of their emotional and mental resilience. At that moment, an unexpected revelation shook the balance of the situation. Sallie's diary and old letters indicated that the presence had not only memory, but intention. She wanted to be recognized, understood, and respected. The previous aggression was not gratuitous malice, but an expression of frustration accumulated over decades of misunderstanding and isolation. Jack and Maria realized that the climax would not be a confrontation of strength, but of empathy and emotional intelligence. They needed to act in harmony, following the patterns of the house, deciphering signs, and respecting Sallie's history. With perfect coordination, Jack began to rearrange the objects in the central circle, while Maria read excerpts from the diary aloud, synchronizing her words with her movements. Each action seemed to dissolve the tension. Doors stopped slamming, objects stabilized, and the intense cold gradually diminished. Sallie House responded, demonstrating that understanding and respect could balance the energy contained within the space. The intelligence of presence was being tested alongside human intelligence, a complex dance of action, perception, and emotion. Then the final twist occurred. A shadow took temporary physical form in the center of the circle. Not a threatening entity, but a recognizable childlike figure, Sallie. She didn't attack. She observed, her eyes reflecting decades of fear, curiosity, and accumulated memory. Jack and Maria realized that the manifestation wasn't an ordinary ghost, but a consciousness shaped by trauma, isolation, and historical experiences. The presence finally communicated fully, recognizing the protagonist's courage, empathy, and intelligence. At the decisive moment, the house revealed its greatest secret. Each previous phenomenon, thrown objects, locked doors, frightening sounds, had been a test of understanding and adaptability. The climax was not the destruction of the presence, but the final interaction, in which Jack and Maria managed to decipher, respect, and interact harmoniously. The circle of objects remained intact, the temperature returned to normal, and the environment, though laden with memory and history, became less hostile. Sallie House had not been conquered. It had taught, demanded, and transformed the protagonists. In the silence that followed, Jack and Maria realized that the experience had profoundly changed them. Fear, tension, and aggression had given way to understanding, respect, and emotional balance. Every physical or psychological scar was now a reminder of learning and growth. Sallie's presence remained, but no longer as a direct threat. She had become part of the story that the protagonist needed to respect and understand, ending the cycle of conflict in a unique and unexpected way. When the first ray of morning sunlight streamed through the windows of Sallie House, Jack and Maria finally breathed a sigh of relief. The silence was absolute, but not threatening. Unlike previous nights, Sallie's presence seemed calm, almost peaceful. Each hallway, each room, still carried memories and traces of the past, but there were no more unexpected attacks or objects flying through the air. The house remained alive, but in a way that didn't demand absolute fear. There was mutual acceptance between the protagonists and the awareness of the child who inhabited it. The two sat in the center of the circle of objects, now rearranged, and exchanged silent glances. Each injury, each scratch, and each night of terror had resulted in learning and growth. Jack understood that logic and reason are not enough to understand certain realities. Some require perception, empathy, and respect. Maria realized that historical knowledge, however detailed, only gains meaning when it connects with lived experiences and human emotions. The experience transformed them, not only as researchers, but as people capable of dealing with the inexplicable without succumbing to fear. The house, though still shrouded in mystery, now functioned as a living memory, a testament to the past and the events that shaped Sallie's consciousness. Documents, objects, and historical records remained in place, preserving history for any future visitor, but without threatening those who understood and respected the space. The lesson was clear. Sallie House was not merely a place of terror, but a catalyst for reflection, growth, and understanding of trauma, memories, and human relationships. The consequences also extended to the relationship between Jack and Maria. The experience intensified their trust, partnership, and emotional sensitivity. Now every gesture was coordinated, every decision made together, learning to balance logic and intuition. Sallie House had tested not only courage, but also their capacity for cooperation and empathy. And by overcoming the climax, they emerged stronger, more attentive, and more connected. The impact on the house's atmosphere was also visible. Narrow corridors and creaking staircases maintained their historic feel, but the signs of aggression had considerably diminished. The intense cold and sudden noises had ceased, replaced by a sense of quiet anticipation, as if the house awaited new visitors, ready to test those who dared to confront its secrets with courage and respect. As Jack and Maria prepared to leave Sallie House, they felt a mixture of relief, reverence, and profound learning. The macabre and intense experience not only revealed the secrets of Sallie's presence, but also transformed them, showing that confronting the inexplicable requires patience, emotional intelligence, and cooperation. They left the house aware that they had participated in something unique, an encounter with an ancient and complex consciousness that defied human comprehension, but also taught lessons about memory, fear, and empathy. The silence that remained when they left was different from the previous silence. There was no threat, only history and memory. Sallie House continued to exist, carrying its mystery, but now Jack and Maria carried with them the understanding that true survival is not measured solely by physical strength or courage, but by the capacity to learn, understand, and respect that which transcends reason. Months later, Jack and Maria continued their lives, but something had changed forever. Jack began documenting paranormal experiences with a more cautious and respectful eye, while Maria delved deeper into historical research, connecting forgotten memories and stories. Sallie House remained silent, observing from afar, its mystery intact. But now, for them, fear had given way to understanding. Each shadow reminded them that certain places hold not only horror, but profound lessons. And although no one else knew, they both knew that the house would continue to test those who dared to cross its gates, demanding courage, respect, and intelligence to survive. If you were surprised by the secrets of Sallie House and felt the tension along with Jack and Maria, share this story with friends who love true mysteries and macabre experiences. Comment with your theories about Sallie's presence and how you would have reacted in the protagonist's place. Like, follow, and turn on notifications so you don't miss new terrifying stories based on true events. Remember, some houses hold secrets that defy reason, and now you were part of this enigma.